Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Responsible Edge podcast with me, Charlie Martin, co-founder of the Anti-Greenwash Charter. Today, I was delighted to be joined by Richard Pike. Richard's somebody that we've known for a while now. He's the Technical and Sustainability Director at COOK, a frozen food production company based here in the UK. We had a really interesting conversation today looking specifically at the food industry, and in particular an article from The Guardian featuring an ethical consumer report that looked at the cocoa industry and some of the supply chain issues there regarding sustainability. So a fascinating kind of insight from Richard, not only on those kind of bigger macro issues at play within the food industry, but then looking specifically at how Richard, within his role at COOK, has gone about implementing changes in the way that things are done there in order to be more sustainable, and some of the experiences that he's had as a technical and sustainability director in convincing and working with his colleagues within the organization to make those changes. So some really kind of personal experience that Richard has had was uncovered during the conversation. So just want to say a big thank you to Richard for joining us today. It was a really interesting conversation. As always, really appreciate you guys listening in. If there are any questions or comments for either ourselves or for Richard, please do leave the comments in the appropriate places. And thanks again for listening. Kick things off by saying, Richard, thank you so much for agreeing to give us up some of your time this morning and join us on an episode of the Responsible Edge. We've obviously pitched to you for a while to try and rope you into joining us, and we finally managed to get you over the line. So yeah, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's I'm looking forward to it.
And just we've just had a little catch up before the recording, and this is the second podcast that you've done. So we've got you kind of at the early stages of the media career, I suppose. This is the launch, if you like.
Yeah, I think this could possibly be my finale as well, but let's see how it goes.
Top man. Richard, as always, really keen to kind of kick off the conversation with giving our listeners like a bit of a background on you, a bit of an understanding of your career, understanding the things that have inspired you, the passions that you have for the things that you do. And some of our guests like literally do choose to go back to kind of the very early stages of that inspired them as children and all the rest of it. Feel free to miss that out or go back there should you wish. Just give us a flavor of you.
Cool. So I've been in the food industry since God was a boy, really, predominantly by accident. And I mainly produce and fruit with some kind of fairly well-known brands and things. And I just gradually got more and more despondent about the way that the industry worked and the way that particularly suppliers were treated in a lot of cases, the inequality around, where the money was in the supply chain, and who was kind of making all the profits and all that sort of stuff. And I had a big falling out with a brand that will remain nameless in 2007, and just thought there's got to be a better way. So I ended up joining this bunch of lunatics that were sticking frozen food in trays and kind of not making any money, and not knowing quite what to do. But there was definitely a different vibe and a different sort of purpose to the whole thing. And I thought, well, fine, let's do that. Because apparently I was going to be a beach bum, and my wife said, yeah, no, that doesn't pay enough. So you need to find a proper job, which was very disappointing. But we've got over that. So yeah, I joined COOK and just doing things differently and treating people more equitably, and just trying to do things a bit better. And so I'm now in my 17th year for my sins as of this week. So this is a good celebration.
Well, a big congratulations on a significant significant milestone. You're not gonna get away with it that easy in terms of not giving us a bit more early Richard Pike career story. So you just talk us through working in food. For what were you doing in food in the sort of earlier part of your career before obviously joining COOK?
So I was always in sort of quality and operational management. So I started off in quality kind of around about the time when the BRC organisation kind of became a thing to try and, before that actually, but the whole point of BRC was kind of everyone gets together. We only have one audit, and then everyone accepts that. And of course, that lasted for about 2 years, and then I can't remember which one broke ranks first, but now you have BRC and all the retailer and multiple audits and all that kind of stuff. So I've always been in the sort of quality technical side of stuff. I did operations management for a few years, from kind of 2000, I think, for a few years, and that was a case of like, well, why do you want to be an ops manager? And I said, well, I've spent most of my life telling operations what to do, and I thought I ought to see it from the other side for once. So that was okay. And then as a kind of technical manager, and I joined COOK as a technical manager. So food safety, health and safety, legislative compliance, and all that kind of stuff. And in 2012, 2013, I just thought we need more focus on the purposey side, the sort of sustainability side of things. So I kind of bolted that on. We didn't do anything really, and I bolted that on, and so I became technical and sustainability director at that point. And that's a kind of, that in itself is a real, one side of the fence is all about compliance, and everything is about reducing everything to an absolute minimum to get the maximum kind of result. And then the other side of the fence is trying not to use all the chemicals and and all the PPE and all the activities that just kind of come as a norm for the technical side of things. So it was quite a challenge. But working with suppliers and just trying to understand from their perspective, their needs, and kind of why there was no money going back to growers and all that kind of stuff. And trying to make a connection between what we were trying to do and the people that were providing the ingredients and stuff to do that. Mm-hmm. And it makes such a difference when you actually connect chefs and people on the back door of our kitchens to the guys that are, spending blood, sweat and tears to kind of create whatever, whether it's vegetables or protein or, meat protein or whatever. And just ensuring that everyone treats everyone fairly, I guess, and has that empathy and understanding, and it goes so far.
I've got two kind of interesting stages, if you like, career-wise. I've got the inspiration that led you to, and I know you don't want to name names, but I want to go back and unpick a little bit and understand a little bit more about the experience that you had that led you to, in 2007, I think you mentioned, moving to COOK, and what it was at that stage in your career that kind of inspired you to look for those new pastures, and what you were looking for in those new pastures in light of some of the frustrations that you had with the industry before. Can you just give us a little bit more of a flavor as to what that experience was like?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that was kind of really sticks in my mind was I was working for a salad grower in Kent, and we had a contract with a supermarket to supply a number of lines. We were based in Kent, but we had quite a big operation in the west as well, over in Shropshire, and it was the spring of 2007 was terrible. It was cold, it was wet, and I don't remember anything about any weather. I can tell you what the summer was like last year, but kind of this one has stuck because of kind of what happened. And we had a program of, I don't know the number, so 25,000 heads of little gem a week or something like that, along with kind of loads of other stuff. And the buyer rang and said, we need a reduction in price. And we said, well, don't be daft, you're not taking anything because of the weather, and we're struggling to grow it. We're ploughing most of it in. We're kind of wasting money hand over fist. So no. And then they rang up 3 days later and said, okay, you're out now. That's it. So it's like, okay, fine, whatever, on that particular line. Mm-hmm. And then the sun came out and the ground dried up and everyone started having barbecues and stuff. And they rang up and said, great, well, we'll have 25,000 heads this week. And we said, well, actually, no, you won't, because we've ploughed it in and you said we weren't doing that. So we planted radish and spring onions and stuff instead. And they said, no, you're in contract, so you will supply. And we ended up flying in lettuce from America because nobody had any, because the weather had been so poor here for like 3 weeks or whatever it was, until such time as we could kind of catch up growing it in the UK. And I just thought, and that was one of the things that was a bit of a catalyst that just said, this is not okay. This is not right, So that was a kind of, the kind of number of other things. I mean, anyone would have thought that kind of growing radish was the end of the world, and you get a few split radish in a bag and this kind of stuff. The thing is completely out of balance. The success of the multiple retailers in this country, from a consumer perspective, is fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. You get the choice you want. You get strawberries all year round, which is stupid. You get apples all year round, which is equally stupid. But we live in a global world. We have a global supply chain. We've created our sort of developed nations' demand has created that market, but there's no seasonality. We've all been taught to expect all our apples to be bright red, all the time. You're not allowed to have any kind of speckling or anything like that. And I think it's getting better. It's definitely getting better. I've been out of this for a while, so I'm obviously a bit jaded. But that was the kind of stuff that was just. I saw 26 pallets of apples get rejected one morning. Brilliant. Cox's Orange Pippin, grown in Kent, with the most marvellous marbling colour on them, because they didn't have block red colour on them. And that's what the spec said. They got rejected. And actually, the grower turned around and delisted the supermarket, which I thought was hilarious at the time. Because they threatened to delist him because he made a mistake, and he said, no, don't worry about it, I've delisted you, I'm never going to supply you again.
I love that.
Which was great, but that was the kind of and to be fair, that's all about marketing gone wrong, rather than supporting Richard. And again, it's different now, they kind of do it much better. But rather than supporting UK growers, who at the time always wanted more anyway, so there was a balance. But and doing things kind of naturally and seasonally, and all the rest of it, there was always a rush for the first UK apple, and they were terrible because they were picked too early. But it was just kind of, look, we've got the first UK apple, and I'm like, people are going to go and buy those and never buy a British apple again because it tastes foul. Stop it. Wait a week, and they'll be beautiful. Anyway,
it's super. Just for my own sanity, in terms of clarifying, I love the term marketing gone wrong. Is that from a food perspective, and we'll base it here in the UK. We'll suggest looking at the market here in the UK, that we've just become. We're expecting almost like a sanitized, totally perfect version of every piece of fruit and veg that we purchase, and therefore we don't understand, appreciate, or value the nuance of like something being produced that might be a little bit different, might be a little bit imperfect. Is that the synopsis of marketing gone wrong, that we've changed expectations of the consumer to be something which is unrealistic?
Absolutely. We've ruined 3 generations of consumers to expect something that just doesn't exist or shouldn't exist. And we've created all of those problems around that. And I know there's a lot of effort now to reduce waste and to kind of and to support local and all of that stuff, which is great. But why it was allowed to go so horribly wrong in the first place, I'm not overly sure about. And it just remains a mystery to me.
But it was the inspiration in those mid 2000s for you to think, right, I'm looking for, as you kind of alluded to in your original introduction, like I'm looking for to work in a space where I feel like I'm surrounded by people that are prepared to do things a bit differently, prepared to approach things in a different way. You mentioned that your really core focus for you was how people were treated. That was a key aspect at the time. Just talk us through, like you mentioned, I think you introduced it perfectly when you said like a load of crazy people that were essentially making no money and producing frozen meals. Just talk us through like what it was in terms of the meeting of mind, if you like, that you went through when you met the guys that were founding COOK, and what encouraged you to think actually these guys have got a chance of doing this differently.
It's quite an interesting question, but it was the weirdest thing. I pitched up for an interview, in a kind of suit and all that kind of stuff, because I come from the corporate world, and the interview took place outside a porter cabin on a picnic table with Dale, one of the co-founders, who was the head chef at the time, outside in his whites, having a fag. And I just thought, oh my goodness me, what am I doing? And he said, we had a decent chat, we had a wander around the kitchen, and I thought, kind of got my work cut out here, but we only employed about, 45, 50 people at the time, and they were great. They were, everyone was happy and smiling and kind of going to the pub after work, which was always close to my heart. And I thought, I've got some work cut out here, because they're all, I walk around the corner and they're all stood outside in their kitchen whites having a fag. And I thought, that's not okay. But they were so passionate.
Low-hanging fruit, Richard. Sorry to interrupt you. Some low-hanging fruit opportunity.
Absolutely. I was known as the Grim Reaper for quite a long time. But they were so passionate about what they were trying to do, and fundamentally, it all came out of Ed. So Ed, we've got Ed and Rosie, who are the co-CEOs, they're siblings. Dale, who was Ed's co-founder, he was the kind of operational and the chefy side of things, and James Perry is our co-chairman. And the Perry's mum, Anne, used to batch cook every weekend. Mm-hmm. And we were actually at an event here last night, and Rosie was talking about it, and she said it always just looked bland and horrible and awful, just kind of sitting in the freezer. But once you brought it back, it was absolutely gorgeous. And that was kind of one of her memories of kind of being young. And the idea was to bring people together over food and kind of have the convenience element of kind of, there's something in the freezer, great, good cooks, appealing to good cooks, but letting them have a night off, so spend some more time with the kids, go for a walk in the park or whatever, because when you come back, the meal's ready. And there was such a bad convenience thing going on around about that sort of time, where food was just a means to an end almost. And it wasn't that kind of sociable opportunity to catch up, to have a chat, to chill out. And that just really appealed. And that's core now to what we try and do is just bringing people together over good food. And the good bit is so very, very broad. It's good ingredients and made by good suppliers and prepared by good people and tasting good and nutritionally good and all of that sort of stuff. So good is kind of quite a bland word, really. It covers a lot of stuff, but that was the aim, and they're still thoroughly passionate about it now, which is just great. Which is why I'm still here after 17 years.
I've 2 questions on that. So one, you would obviously had that experience pre-2007 where you'd seen the way that suppliers were being treated. What was it about meeting with Dale and Ed? What convinced you about the way that they were going to approach supply chain that sort of address that issue? Was that core to that decision that you made to join?
It was, because I mean we had I think 5 or 6 suppliers at the time. One was the local fishmonger in Rainham, about 5 miles away, and they'd worked with him since the beginning, and it didn't matter what they needed or how much they messed him about, which they tried not to do, not suggesting it was a thing, but he was always there. And then it was Shane who came and brought the fish to the back door and would have a chat with the guys, and they knew him, he knew them, he knew what they needed and why they needed it. And one of the things I think, I mentioned earlier about having those kind of relationships, and they were really evident then, because if you now we're an awful lot bigger. If you talk to, I don't know, a beef supplier about diced beef, and you say you're a ready meal manufacturer, they've got an image of the kind of product that you want, and we're like, no, you need to come to the kitchen. You need to see what we're doing with your product and how we use your product before you can understand what it is that we're looking for you to supply. And all that kind of relationship stuff was evident right from the beginning. And we now have, I don't know, 160, 170 suppliers or something. And we can't have that relationship with them all, but we try. We still try to make sure that that we know them all, we visit them all, we see them all, we catch up socially if we can. Because that side of things is just the most important part of any business relationship, whether it's a supplier or anyone else. But having a proper relationship where we're as open and transparent as possible with each other, and there's the terrible thing is that that's actually difficult to achieve with suppliers who are used to supplying more corporate clients. I went to our pasta supplier a few years ago now in southern Italy, and because I was going and I had technical in my title, they took us into the boardroom, and the boardroom table was just full of paperwork and manuals and HACCP and BRC certificates and all the rest of it. And I went, great, now can we go and have a look at the product and meet some people, please? And they were just kind of so excited that actually I wanted to get under the skin of what they were trying to do and just meet them. And we ended up going and having lunch with the site director's mum in the village. It's because it's just. But anyway, it's that kind of stuff. Relationships are so important and so key.
And would you and you mentioned there before about how the passion, if you like, for doing things good, if you like, that's sustained over the time that you've been with COOK. Like how is that done? How do you achieve that?
Have we got all day?
Maybe we can start a series, but just give us what are the headlines?
Well, so I think one of the headlines is that Ed. So Rosie joined the business. I don't know, 2010 or 11 maybe. I can't remember. She'll probably kill me. But Ed always used to talk about purpose, but he couldn't kind of elucidate what that meant really. And we have a couple of offsites every year, and we were on an offsite, and it was 1:30 in the morning or something, and we basically nailed him in the corner of a pub and said, look, unless you can tell us what this purpose thing means, in about 2010, I think, unless you can tell us what this purpose thing means, we can't deliver it for you, and we can't progress anything. And he said, well, I can't talk about it because there's loads of stuff that we're just not good enough at. And we kind of said, well, yeah, but unless we know what it is you want to be good at, how do we try and get better at stuff? And then along came the kind of the B Corp thing, and we went to Boulder to their Champions Retreat, which was great of them to let us turn up. So we weren't B Corps at the time, just to try and learn some more. And that's what we were looking for. We were looking for some way of kind of measuring what that purpose thing meant. But one of the things that it did when we went through the BIA and answered all the questions and just kind of took months to do it, one of the things it did was kind of freed us up to be able to talk about the stuff that we believed in, but be honest enough to say that we weren't very good at it. Because we were always a bit scared of kind of sticking our heads above the parapet. We hadn't made any money for a few years. You know, it's kind of, you're going to get shot at. And actually, it doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. Just tell people the truth. And then they'll either like it or not. One or the other. But if you're genuine, and what you're trying to do is genuine, then it becomes who you are and what you do. And I think then the creation of our values, which we live by really, really closely, and the way that we communicate those and remind everyone in the business all of the time, you know, they are so crucial. And it's a bit of a, you know, it's a bit old hat, isn't it, really, talking about values, but they are crucial to us. Absolutely crucial.
Well, I have to say, and obviously you kindly invited us on site not long ago to come to the dessert factory or production space, and I think the thing that we were really struck by coming away was just how a lot of those things that you had told us about in terms of like the way that things are done, like you got a genuine sense of you know. People talk about people first, don't they? But there was a genuine sense of people being looked after and people feeling like they were working for an organization that really did genuinely care. And that's why everybody had been there for so long. So it was a really interesting insight from our point of view. Richard, as I totally expected us to do, we've literally spent 27 minutes talking about you and background and COOK, and I'm really pleased that we have. But in danger of not getting on to, I guess, the focus, if you like, for today's conversation, would you mind possibly just starting by just providing a brief synopsis and overview of the Guardian piece that we shared with you before the show, pulling out any particular areas, I suppose, in light of our conversation that we've had thus far, but things that you think are really kind of important to draw out and perhaps address during the rest of our conversation?
Yeah, sure. So the piece that we were talking about was a criticism of the chocolate supply chain, which is perfectly valid. And there are players in the chain like Tony Chocolonely who are kind of trying to do things completely different in a completely different way. There is child labour in that chain. There is an awful lot of poverty. There's a lot of criminal activity in that chain. And it's another one of those things that has been built up by, for want of a better word, developed nations or European demand, probably. Certainly the global north demand. And the criticism leveled at companies like Mondelez and Nestle and whoever about not fixing their supply chain are valid, but equally you can't do it overnight. And there's this real kind of tension between, thinking that a PLC that makes millions can just, or potentially even billions, but can just spend all of those millions fixing problems in the supply chain. And actually, that's not how PLCs work, by the very nature of what they are. So the whole kind of the business structural thing is wrong, which is another, it's the kind of the bedrock of being a B Corp, actually, is to kind of change the purpose of a business from kind of making profit at all costs to kind of doing things better. But when you look at the comparison between some of those big PLCs and the likes of Tony Chocolonely, for example, a brand that is set up from the beginning to do things differently and to drive that change has engaged a set of consumers that support that. And therefore they can really kind of use every bit of resource they've got to make sure that the little bit that they're doing, they are doing differently. A brand that is trying to change, and for a PLC that's really, really difficult, but for a brand that is trying to change the way it operates to become more purposeful and to kind of make sure that it gets rid of all those flaws and risks and abuse in the supply chain, is probably fighting on multiple fronts as well, and can't spend all of its hard-earned on solving those problems. And that's a real dichotomy for me, because I am thoroughly critical of them for what they do. But we buy chocolate. We try and buy it as responsibly as we can. But we can't afford to put 30% on the cost of everything, on the cost of all our ingredients. We make a few million a year, most of which we reinvest. We can't afford to put 3 million quid on top of our ingredient purchasing, but we'd love to. We'd absolutely love to. But we can't kind of fix it all overnight. So I think it is it's a really, really challenging area to be involved in, I think.
If you think back to the beginning of COOK, and I know we've heavily focused on COOK, but those two sort of, I guess, cases, if you like, whereby you're an organization that can kind of, establish yourself on the foundation of perhaps we're going to charge a little bit more for our offering, or be able to, but be absolutely able to present complete supply chain transparency and ethical management of supply chain and engagement with supply chain. Is that where was COOK at? Was COOK an evolution towards that way of doing things, or were a lot of these things kind of set in stone from the conception of the business?
No, it was definitely an evolution. So the relationship thing was there, but everything was about quality and about doing things by hand. So the people thing, fundamentally, the people thing and the community thing were hard baked into the DNA. The sustainability side of stuff was an awakening over time, and B Corp really helped with that. So the focus was on quality, and absolute quality, and still is to a very great degree, obviously. But that was our point of difference. and the fact that we were buying high quality ingredients and that we were then making food by hand with real people, some of whom had been disadvantaged and all that kind of stuff. But the animal welfare bit was the thing that we became much more aware of first and started to work hard on. And the sustainability and kind of the longer supply chain stuff, and the sort of what growers and farmers actually needed from a business like ours, that's something that has developed over time. So we are in the same place as some of those big PLCs, trying to make a transition that we can't charge our consumers for. We can try and encourage them to buy a bit more to help us out, to help us on that journey. But there's a ceiling to what you can charge, and therefore there is a limit to what you can do. And we are fighting on so many fronts, as most of these businesses are, who are in that kind of transition. And if you're trying to fix your place in the community, you're trying to pay your people more than the real living wage, not the government phony one, because that's just a load of nonsense anyway, but the kind of proper living one, and you're trying to support them and their families, you're trying to give enough back to the growers to make their life sustainable. That's, and of course the planet stuff. We've got old buildings with some really crap refrigeration. We've had a terrible year on our carbon footprint. We need about 4 million quid to fix it. Yeah. I had a chat with a Welsh farmer last year who was, they're doing a lot around kind of regenerative beef and stuff, which is fantastic. But the way that the farming subsidy system used to work was that a guy would make a 20 grand loss, but get a 40 grand subsidy. So he thought he'd made a 20 grand profit for the year. It's just like, it's insane. But we can't fix it overnight, can we?
What
we just have to have a will.
But let's unpick that, because I think that I have to admit I drew the sort of same conclusion. I thought it was really interesting within that article that they kind of crescendoed it by going through and having all of these statements from all of the organizations or the businesses that were detailed, explaining that they refuted, I guess, ethical consumers' insights, if you like, on the basis that no, we are doing things. We've all got a sustainability program. We're all looking at improving our supply chain. We're all committing to that. It's not perfect, but we're all moving in a direction, which I think is what you've just acknowledged, which is like these are big tankers. They're not going to be able to shift themselves in the water overnight. It is going to take time. With your hat on at COOK, and thinking about the fact that you can't just overnight wand and everything change. How do you go about, from your position, like identifying and then building a business case for something to be the next thing to engage with, the next opportunity for development? Like what do you do, both in terms of the planning of that and equally in terms of how you go about convincing other perhaps more commercially focused people within the organization?
So we have a materiality assessment that we kind of review every year. So that will take into account emerging risks, customer perception, business opportunity, all of that kind of stuff. And then it's a bum fight, if I'm honest. But we end up with a kind of a list of priorities across the business. And there is a really good degree of challenge and rigor that kind of goes into the process of deciding what our next year's or our next 5 years or our next 10 or 15-year ambitions are, and how we're going to try and achieve them. And we're always more ambitious than we can ever deliver, because that's just the nature of the beast. So it's always a bit disappointing when you get to the end of the year and go, oh, I didn't do that. But there's always stuff you have done, and I think the acceptance that you have to do the stuff that is the most important. We're very lucky that our board requires us to deliver on our purpose mission, and they get very cross if we're not doing that, which is great. So there's always, and that's where it all has to come from, isn't it? And then we just have to use the bum fight method to just make sure that we're working in the areas that are going to make the most impact. And very often that's not the things that are the sexiest or the things that kind of we all really enjoy the most or whatever, but it is definitely about driving to sort of the impact through.
Richard, let me ask you on that. I think it would be really interesting to get an example from you as to a non-sexy initiative. Like what are the sorts of things that we're talking about?
Well, so we'll do a non-sexy one, but we'll do a sexy one too. So the sexy one might just
This is
be
all getting a bit risque, Richard. I think we've had sexy said so many times in a short period on the show. But go on.
It's kind of important in as much that that's where people's enthusiasm lies. So we have a thing called the kindness fund, and all of our shops they're all empowered to kind of engage in random acts of kindness. So if they know, they know a lot of their customers and kind of whatever, if they know that someone is trying to look after a partner who's got cancer or something, or whatever, then they can just give free meals away, or to kind of just to help them out. And it's tiny, it's small, but the response, the feedback,
awesome.
It's phenomenal. It's absolutely awesome. I mean, from a sort of feel good perspective. Does it move the dial? Nah. But it's a really, really lovely thing to do. Changing our refrigeration in our original kitchen, which is going to be expensive, is going to, and quite apart from just the cost, we're going to have to shut the thing down for a fortnight and all of that sort of stuff, because we are leaking gas into the atmosphere. That's not sexy at all. That's just something that we're going to have to do. We're going to have to spend loads of cash on, that we get no actual visible benefit from, but we have to do it. It's the right. We cannot be polluting the atmosphere with refrigeration gas. We just can't. But it's the only person that's excited about it happening in the business is me, probably, because but everyone acknowledges that it's just something that has to happen. But it's not sexy.
And Richard, is that because when you presented the requirement for that, investment to be made, that actually tying it back to those core values, as you've alluded to, and suggesting, look, if we want to act upon these values, then although it's not sexy, and although it commercially is painful, that actually when you step back and you look at the bigger commercial picture, we are only as good as our implementation and association with our values, and doing this aligns with those values. So it might feel like, you look at the P&L, you look at the financial output right now, and you think, Christ, that's a significant investment. But actually, when you're starting to broadly think about the long-term implications of these decisions, it's not such an expensive thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we're a purposeful business. We members of business declares. We've got a net zero by 2030 target, which is looking dodgy, like most are. But if you've got all of those, but you're not actually going to kind of make the investment to deal with the thing that's causing the problem in the first place, where does that leave you? You know, that makes you, yeah, that puts you in a really bad place.
Super interesting. I love how we've been able to tie, I guess, themes from this to some very practical experiences that you've gone through. Was there anything else, just in terms of like any other themes that were in that article that you think anyone else sitting here, like listening to this, thinking to themselves, you know, we're a slightly more established company. It is difficult to instigate change, if you like, in terms of the way that we do things. What would be from your experience your recommendations on how to go about doing that? Like what are the things that organizations can look to do in order to ease that path towards development and growth?
I think it's engagement largely, but it's engagement with everyone that's affected or part of the problem. And if you go back to the chocolate piece, if you think about East Africa, there's no condoning the fact that there's child labour, but those families have, for whatever reason, had to do that for the last 40, 50 years. That's how they make their living. That's an established thing. If you then turn around to them and go, guys, we're going to stop you doing that because these kids need to go to school, you know, so we've made that decision. We can do that. The depth of fear that is now in those families' eyes. The only way they know to make money is to do what they've been doing for the last 50 years. And palm is no different. You know, all of those kind of commodity type industries. But the ones that have been successful are the ones that have said, look, wouldn't it be great if actually your kids could get an education and, you know, in a few years' time, this village is going to have people going to university and all that kind of stuff and be feeding money back into the village and, you know, your living standards are going to go up. Is that we kind of, we're going to build you a school, you know? And that's how you, that's how you kind of, that change is radical for those people. They're not even going to want, they're not going to want to engage in it or be part of it. But if you don't engage who your true stakeholders are, whether and kind of internally and externally, there's no reason to do anything. And actually what you try and do, even with the best intentions, probably gets kicked back anyway. Because you're assuming that you know what people need and want. And sometimes they just want to be spoken to like proper human beings and have their, you know, have their opinions taken into account.
Very good. It kind of lends itself onto the final question because, as expected, Richard, we have rattled through the episode.
I told you I waffle.
No. You waffle. I mean, if this is you waffling, this is you. You're a brilliant waffler, if that's if I'm able to say it. Let's crescendo though and pull things together. I feel like I know perhaps where you're going to angle this, but if you were to be given that magic wand and you could change, you know, one thing about the commercial world that we're living in, what would you do?
I would require absolute transparency. There's a thing around kind of whether competition is healthy or not. I would argue in our world, it often isn't. And what it does is it kind of creates elitism at one end and a mess at the other. But one of the things that we talk about quite a lot is radical candor. And if that exists, then people can chuck stones at you and that's fine. And if a business is out to make the most money it possibly can in the shortest possible time, great. If that's its aim, that's fine. But I want to know about that, because I then can make a choice as to whether I want to support that business or not. Because in an ideal world, I won't. Or maybe I will, but I'll do it knowing that actually that's the only way that I can get the service I need at the price I need by tomorrow. So, do you know what? On this occasion, I'm going to have to do it.
It's a trade. It's a trade-off, but from an informed perspective.
Absolutely. And the worst thing is those businesses that have like 1% of their range that is ethical. However you determine that, definitely, you know, what that means. And that's what they talk about all the time. And they don't talk about the 99% that is just screwing everything and ruining people's, you know, livelihoods and all that kind of stuff at the other end of the supply chain. But hey, no, this bit is great. You know, this is wonderful. It's like, fuck off. Lasted nearly an hour, Charlie, without having.
I love it. I love it. Zach's thinking, "Oh, I'm gonna have to label this as having obscene content in it."
Feel free to cut that bit, Zach. It's fine.
I love it. It's really interesting that you pull that out. Like, it's one of the things that we've been actually working on from a charter perspective, and from a charter perspective with our signatories, where we have made it an optional element of any new green claims policy, but there is some question around internally about whether or not it becomes a mandatory section. But we now have a section which is where we could improve. And so we're encouraging every organization to detail in their green claims policy, these are the environmental sort of impact areas where we know that we're not perfect and that we're looking to drive an improvement in those areas. And again, it's not, I love the use of that term, radical candor. I think that's such a, is that a COOK term, or is that a Richard Pike term?
Oh no, it's it's come through one of the many kind of gurus that our chief creative officer has introduced to the business. But yeah, I mean, it's just something that makes so much sense. And actually, if it exists and it's, you know, and it exists in truth, then there are no pot shots.
Well, indeed, and we would also be able to. I think this is one of the things that we've noticed as well is that whole. You know, we often talk about the problems of not being transparent and not having kind of radical candor. I'm going to use that term from a kind of a local individual organization perspective, but in terms of the collective, like your idea of that being applied across the board. Imagine how much better our decision making as a collective is going to be, and how much quicker we're going to be able to adapt and evolve in terms of our approach to some of these major issues facing us all. Like, we're going to have informed decision makers across the board, and that's going to get us so much further on, so much quicker, irrespective of how it's going to impact upon, you know, organizations at an individual kind of corporate level.
So, as just a very quick example, in our industry, compostable packaging is a real kind of issue, in as much that 5% of the UK population have access to a compost bin. Yes, compostable packaging is technically compostable. The infrastructure does not exist. So let's be honest about that. And we either then go down that route and we all campaign to get the infrastructure in place and put pressure on the government or whatever, or we need to be looking at complete circularity or whatever. But those challenges aren't, people that are using compostable packaging are going, aren't we great? Look, it's green, compostable packaging, woo! Bollocks.
You're on a roll now.
That's not a dig against compostable packaging, by the way. It's just the message that goes out is that it's brilliant, it's wonderful, we're doing the right thing, it's fantastic. And actually, that message should be appended with, please lobby your local MP to get the infrastructure in place so that actually we can make this work in the future. And that's fine. Don't have a problem with that.
Yeah. No, I'm with you. We need collective activism in order to develop what's required in order for those initiatives to actually have impact, true impact, as opposed to just being used as a marketing or promotional gimmick.
Yeah, absolutely that. And that's the bit that when it gets gimmicky, it's just, please.
Well, let's leave it there, Richard. We can. I feel like we can, as I say, have on. We can have an after dark version, perhaps an after watershed version of Richard Pike. But honestly, thank you so much for today. That was really helpful, really interesting. Lots of particularly interesting things for listeners operating within the food sector, but definitely some broader lessons I think that can be applied across all organisations. So, Richard, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.